Here we are again. This is lecture 5. You don't realize this, but I've tried this a whole bunch of times, and something has gone wrong every single time. So one last time. Hopefully we'll get through it. Today we're going to talk about the British colonies. So we have these British colonies that are developing in the eastern part of North America. So these are the colonies that are most directly going to impact American history and American culture. Ultimately, these colonies will spread. The descendants of these colonies will spread westward and become the United States. So we need to understand where these British colonies were coming from. Also, we're going to understand the regional differences that are going to develop in these different colonies. So when we look at these British colonies, we're going to analyze the factors including environment, geography, climate, and natural resources, as well as religious and cultural influences contributed to regional differences in the British colonies. This is corresponding to Key Concept 2.1.3 on your AP guide. And this story is really going to begin in 1588 with the conflict between Spain and England. You got to remember that during this time, or at least as far as the Roman Catholic world was concerned, and Spain was part of that Roman Catholic world, North America was Spain. But let's face it, North America is a huge piece of real estate. It's really hard for the Spanish to control the whole thing. You just can't do it. So the reality is many folks, including Roman Catholic France and Holland, are going to simply, they're just going to ignore Spain, and they're going to do their own explorations in North America. The French in the St. Lawrence Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. The Dutch are going to settle in, along the Hudson. And ultimately, the English are going to establish their own colonies in the New World. So how is this going to come about? Well, and with regard to England, it starts in 1588 when Roman Catholic Spain had a conflict with Protestant England and their upstart queen Elizabeth I. Who's this queen? So we're going to take her out. So the Spanish decided that they were going to send their armada to England to teach this British queen a lesson. And it didn't quite work out that way. In fact, the armada gets to England. They have these large lumbering ships, these Spanish warships. And they were up against these smaller, faster British warships. And quite frankly, the British warships were better captained than the Spanish were. And the Spanish lost. They not only lost, they lost really bad. They lost almost all of their ships. Many of them sunk during the battle. Some of them dashed up against the rocks in Ireland as they fled storms. But either way, bad news for the Spanish Armada, good news for England. England now, without the Spanish Armada to stand in their way, England is now able to move their ships and have relatively free reign over the Atlantic, and they're going to be able to establish their colonies in North America. These colonies are going to be purposeful. I mean, and the purpose is largely to make money. The English colonies were chartered by the king. Well, usually the king. Elizabeth also chartered some territories. But these were chartered by the King of England. And they would be chartered for a reason, usually to make money. So we had these corporate colonies. These corporate colonies were primarily investments. They were profit, moving institutions. They were owned by joint stock companies. These joint stock companies are, of course, we've talked about them before. They are businesses in which multiple investors invest in one enterprise to minimize their risks and maximize not necessarily maximize their profits, but maximize the potential for profit. Hugely successful enterprises, right? So these were corporate colonies. When the king chartered these colonies to a joint stock company, they were corporate colonies. Royal colonies were lands just owned by the king, and they were going to function for the purposes of the king. And then, of course, our proprietary colonies. These were colony grants that were put forward by private owners who were going to own these colonies. Now, Now, not everybody, of course, if you own a big plot of land in Virginia, you're not going to go out there by yourself and try to farm that land. No, you're going to need workers. And the workers were largely indentured servants. In other words, these were people who themselves could not afford the passage to get to North America, so they would trade their labor for passage and for the opportunity to come into North America and get away from the stuff that was impoverishing them in England. So you would simply say, all right, well, if you pay for my passage, I will work for you completely for 7 years, and at the end of that 7 years, my indenture is paid, and I'll be on my merry way. Of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get a tract of land. It depends on the terms of your indenture. So another thing that the British did that was a little bit different from the French and from the Spanish is that the British were interested in permanent settlements, permanent English settlements that were answerable to the Crown of England. This was a mercantilist endeavor. And of course, to do that, you need more than just men going there. So the British actually are going to encourage families to move into these colonies and reproduce the colonies. Consequently, English colonials were a lot less dependent upon Native Americans. Specifically, English men were less dependent upon Native American women, whereas French colonials would actually marry and interact with native tribes. Not so much the English; they weren't interested, and it wasn't a necessity for them. So, a very different kind of order of business. Now, the first colony that we'll talk about is the Chesapeake colony, the Chesapeake colonies. This constituted Virginia and Maryland, both named after English queens. So Virginia is a reference actually to Queen Elizabeth, is going to be established. The very first English colony, permanent English colony in the New World is the colony of Jamestown. Almost ended in disaster. It was almost not the first permanent settlement because the people who went to Jamestown were looking for gold, and there ain't no gold. So they spent a lot of time trying to find gold, not an awful lot of time trying to put food aside for the winter. Yeah. So things didn't go very well for them at first, but ultimately they will be supplied, and they will find actually a form of gold, not necessarily the metal kind of gold, but rather the profit kind of gold. They were able to use and cultivate a crop called tobacco. So here's your tobacco. It's a wonderful crop if you want to make a lot of money. So this crop is actually, I mean, if you're going to have a crop, you might as well have something that's addictive. To guarantee sales, and tobacco fit that bill. This is going to become an international crop. It's going to become a global commodity, one of the first global commodities. So Virginia is going to do quite well. And there are some folks who do a little less well than others. We're still going to start to see the remnants of class conflict. Most importantly, in what's called Bacon's Rebellion, in which a landowner by the name of Bacon decided, he wanted to kill all the Indians he wanted to kill, and the governors of the Virginia colony were like, we really don't want to tick off the Indians all that much. Let's leave them alone. And he said, oh yeah, and he accuses them of being a new gentry in the New World, and he starts to fan this rivalry. He ultimately is going to attack Jamestown, burn it to the ground, but he doesn't live very much longer himself. I don't want to say fortunately, but he dies, and whatever his rebellion was dies with him. But we're seeing the elements of this class conflict happening in Virginia. The next colony, of course, is Maryland. Maryland was very interesting. It was founded by Catholics. For Catholics, hence it was named after Queen Mary, a Catholic, Roman Catholic Queen of England, also known as Bloody Mary. We won't get into that, but this was a land where Catholics could settle and worship, and Protestants could settle and worship, and this was one of the few places where there was religious toleration for Christians. Doesn't last very long. Ultimately, the Protestants will take control of the centers of government in the colony, and they will produce favoritism for Protestants as well, as opposed to Catholics. But at least for a brief period of time, we had a place where there was some form of religious toleration. Another experiment in religion took place in the New England colonies. Now, geographically speaking, when we talk about the geography and the environment, the Chesapeake region was a pretty good place for large-scale farming. New England, not so much. Pretty good place for trade. Lots of nice ports, shipping, fishing, even lumber, timber and stuff like that. But not so much for large-scale farming. But it was a pretty good place, and Britain found that the New World was a really great place to ship off your religious dissidents so they can't create trouble in your own country. They can create trouble in the middle of the wilderness where nobody can hear them. So among these religious dissidents, of course, were Puritans. Puritans were a Protestant sect that believed that the Church of England was a corrupt institution and that it needed to be reformed. It needed to be changed, especially those corrupt Church of England officials, Anglican officials. Oh, well, you can imagine that the Anglican officials, whether they were corrupt or not, are going to take offense at this characterization, and they are going to suggest that the Puritans may want to find another home somewhere far, far away where they can't bother anybody. And they did. They're going to settle in what becomes known as the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Another group of people, a little bit more radical group of people, were separatists. We know them as the Pilgrims, the folks that started the first Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims were a little bit more radical than the Puritans. The Pilgrims were a little more radical than the Puritans in that they believed, hey, look, the Church of England is hopelessly corrupt. It cannot be reformed, so the best way to deal with that is to just not be a part of it and separate from it. The Pilgrims will set out, they'll spend a little time in Holland, and then they'll head across to North America and establish their colonies. It's very easy to look at these groups and say, well, you know what, these folks were looking for religious freedom. Well, ish. They were looking for religious freedom for themselves. The Puritans and the Separatists wanted to be able to practice their religious beliefs freely. So there was that. Not so much for you. If you weren't a Puritan or a Separatist, you were not welcome in these colonies. And in fact, so if you went into a Puritan colony and stayed there for any amount of time, you wouldn't be killed or anything like that, but you would have no real rights. You would not be a real member of the community. You would not be able to vote on in community matters or colonial matters, and you would really not be welcome. So it was best to not be there. And of course, even people who within these groups that kind of went astray, they were kind of asked politely to leave. So such folks included fellows like one of my favorites, Roger Williams. Roger Williams is the founder of Rhode Island, and I am a Rhode Islander, hence he is one of my favorites. But he's also a very interesting fellow. He was a Puritan minister, but he had come to believe that individual salvation was a matter of conscience. That it wasn't necessarily something that could be governed by church authorities. This was some kind of variation of this was fairly common during this time. This idea that, look, just because you're a church authority does not give you dominion over my personal conscience. So of course, Roger Williams, you got to go, man, because you're challenging our authority as a church, as church officials, as people who speak, in the interest of this godly community. So he was asked politely to leave. He heads down to the Narragansett Bay, becomes relatively friendly with the natives down there, and establishes his own colony based on religious toleration, called Providence Plantations, which will later become Rhode Island, and it will be chartered by the king. Providence Plantations, Rhode Island, was the only place in the world at this time, as far as I know, that actually practiced true religious toleration. You could go there and be of equal status, whether you were a Protestant or a Catholic or a Quaker or a Jew or whatever. You could practice your religious beliefs in Providence Plantations. Anne Hutchinson is another one of my favorites. She believed in a belief called antinomianism. And antinomianism is this idea that it is through faith alone that you can be saved. that whatever it is that you do, whatever your position is in the church, it really doesn't matter. That faith in Jesus Christ is the only thing that can save you. Well, again, this is kind of a challenge to the church officials. The church officials had a couple problems with Anne Hutchinson. One, she was kind of challenging their authority. Two, she's a woman. And she is interpreting the Bible for other people. And everybody knows, of course, that women are way too sensitive and emotional and simple to interpret this very serious and solemn document. They're going to open it up, they're going to read it, they're going to interpret it, and they're going to mess it all up. So we're going to put her on trial, and we're going to show her up, and we're going to humiliate her. And of course, it didn't quite work out that way. The great church elders came around, and they these great theologians of their time came to debate her, and well, it didn't work out quite. So it turned out that she ended up out debating them. It turned out she was a lot smarter than they were, and of course, therefore, she has just got to go. And they will kick her out. Ultimately, on her way to go to Providence Plantations, she will be killed by angry Indians. Actually, she and all 13 of her children will be killed by upset Indians. We also have another group of colonies here called the Restoration Colonies. The Restoration Colonies are colonies that were that were chartered during a period known as the Restoration. And it was simple enough. But there's a little backstory here. Just before this time, there was a king by the name of Charles I. He'd kind of overstepped his authority, ticked the people off, they chopped his head off. The country was run for a few years there by kind of a theocratic republic. And then ultimately Charles II will come along and will be crowned king, and therefore the monarchy will be restored to England. This is kind of it in a nutshell. If you want more information, go get some. So Charles II was very interested in building up his colonial possessions in the New World. Among the first of these was the Carolinas, the North and South Carolina. They were very, very similar climate and geography as Virginia. Really good for growing tobacco, great crop. Also good for growing rice. Some good wet areas in there for growing rice. And these colonies were oftentimes given over to his supporters, to the people who helped restore him to the crown. He rewarded them by giving them tracts of land in the Carolinas. Also, Charles II noticed another problem. Right in between New England and the Chesapeake colonies and his Restoration colonies in the South, he noticed that, well, wait a minute, there's a Dutch colony there called New Amsterdam, and it's kind of inconvenient. So we need to kind of get rid of that. So of course he gets one of his admirals to go down there and ask the Dutch to leave. The Dutch are surrounded by English, so they say, yeah, all right, well, we'll give up our lands. And these lands were called New Amsterdam. Well, once the English took over those colonies called New Amsterdam, they had the name changed to New York and to New Jersey. Another colony that's going to come about during this time is a colony founded by this fellow here, William Penn. Actually, William Penn II. His father, William Penn, was a knighted major landowner in England. But William Penn the Younger is going to convert to a religion called Quakerism. And the Quakers were kind of an annoyance to the English church and to the English monarchy, both. And yet William Penn himself was the son of a very important person in England. The Quakers believed that religious authority came from the searching of your soul, came from within. And if religious authority comes from within, comes from the soul, then the words of the church fathers and the church authorities were irrelevant, and even to a certain extent, the Bible was a secondary source of religious authority. the Quakers also had this uneasy belief in peace and equality. Oh my God, we can't have that, right? They believed that God's creation was perfect, man was perfect, therefore there should not be any noble distinctions between one group of men and another group of men. They would refer to call the nobility sir or my lord. For instance, they refused to bow to their betters, as it were. So they also had a thing about, destroying God's creation. Warfare they were against. They refused to participate in the military. They refused to kill for the king. So they just have to go. William Penn, a converted Quaker, is going to be, chartered land that will become known as Pennsylvania, or Penn's Forest, if you will. And this is going to become a Quaker center of the country. Georgia will also is a really good place for getting rid of problematic people in England, except in this case the problematic people are not religious people or religious dissidents, they are debtors, people who are taking up room in the debtors' prison. It was decided that many of these folks were better served just sending them to another land. Georgia was a good place to put them because Georgia was a nice little buffer zone between valuable Carolinas and Virginia and Spanish Florida. Now again, these colonies were designed to make, a big part of this was to make money. This was a mercantilistic endeavor. In other words, the economy of these colonies were not there to serve the colonies. The money that was made in these colonies were to enrich England, were to enrich the nation, the mother nation. This was mercantilism. So anything that was done, whether it was agriculture or fishing or trade or anything like that, was to serve the interests of England. To that effect, there was something called the Navigation Acts that were put into effect. These Navigation Acts mandated that trade goods could only be carried on English ships. Okay, you could not build your own ship. You could not. You could build your own ships, but they would be English ships. You couldn't put things on French ships or Dutch ships and conduct trade that way. This is a way of making sure that England is able to control and, of course, charge for these commodities. All goods transported to the colonies had to pass through England first. So if the colonies were getting trade goods from France or from Holland or from wherever, all of those had to stop in a British port first before they could be moved on to the colonies. Again, this is a way of taxing. And there were certain enumerated goods, such as tobacco, that could only be shipped to England. And of course, this list of enumerated goods gets longer and longer as time goes on. And these are things that the English decided was either too valuable or too important to English interests to let other people have them. So these were goods that had to be shipped to England itself. Now there are some benefits to these Navigation Acts. If you were in shipping, or if you were one of the people who were lucky enough to own large monopolies, such as the large tobacco monopolies in the Carolinas and in the Virginia colonies, then this worked out for you pretty well. You could pretty much name your own price. Colonial manufacturers were kind of stuck. They really couldn't sell their wares outside of the colonies. And also, the fact that there were charges and taxes put on these products going through English ports meant that raised the cost of these goods by the time they got to the Americas. And that meant that colonials were going to have to pay more for the products that they wanted. We also see, this was a time before internet and before telephones and before instant communication. The king is nominally the head of these colonies, the leader of these colonies, but he's thousands of miles away. He can't make the decisions that are necessary in his colonies. So these colonies were going to have to figure out ways of governing themselves. Now, oftentimes the king would simply send governors to represent him, to run these colonies, royal governors, to run these colonies in his name. Oftentimes this caused some problems and some conflicts. But what's very interesting during this time is we start to see the very beginnings of representative government. Many of these initial colonies did not start with royal governors, and they had to figure out ways of controlling themselves. In Virginia, we see the rise of something called the House of Burgesses, where this was a kind of a House of Representatives to a certain extent, in which people who were qualified to vote, in other words, they were land-owning men, could elect people to represent them in the House of Burgesses. New England is going to, your pilgrims, for instance, are going to create the very first written set of laws in the New World called the Mayflower Compact. And this was, as pictured here, this was, look, the pilgrims get to the New World and realize, hey, we need some rules here to guide us. This Mayflower Compact is going to allow for a certain amount of democratic government. Again, you have to be a land-owning male in order to participate. Also, too, especially in New England, the New England colonies, you also had to be a member of the church of that particular colony. So this was democratic-ish, democracy light, but there were certainly going to be limits on democracy, such as the male ownership and the property restricting voting to male property owners and church membership. And that's it. That is our discussion and our analysis of the colonies in England. Have a good day.